Forget everything you thought you knew about noble Rome, with its marble statues and wise laws. In this video, we are going to crack open one of the filthiest and most shameful chapters of ancient history, a page the Romans themselves would have preferred to erase from memory forever. You will learn how an empire that boasted of its civilization committed a monstrous crime against 30,000 unarmed people who believed in a promise of peace. We will tell the story of a simple shepherd who single-handedly brought the greatest military machine of antiquity to its knees, forcing Roman generals to tremble with fear and humiliation. Why were elite legions unable to cope with an army of ghosts for years? And to what depths did the Senate have to sink when Roman steel proved powerless? A denouement awaits you, the cynicism of which will make your blood run cold. The finale of this story will teach a cruel lesson about the price of trust and reveal the true face of betrayal, which, as it turns out, is paid for in a way assassins never expect. Imagine the smell of hot dust mixed with the metallic taste of fear clogging your throat. You are standing under the scorching sun of Spain, surrounded by 30,000 people. Men, women, the elderly, children. They did not come here to die. They came for hope. Look into their faces. Do you see that relief? They believe the war is over. They believe the word of Rome. What a monstrous, fatal mistake. The Roman Republic, that insatiable maw of the ancient world, always knew how to sell catchy slogans. Peace, friendship, prosperity. But by the middle of the 2nd century BC, the words of senators were worth less than sour wine in a Sabura tavern. In the year 150 BC, the propraetor Servius Sulpicius Galba offered the Lusitanians a deal they couldn't refuse. Lay down your arms. Come down from the mountains. Rome will give you fertile land. Rome will feed your children. Sounds like the mercy of a great civilization, doesn't it? But you are here, in this valley, and you feel the air change. Look at the legionaries standing in the cordon. Their faces are hidden beneath the cheek guards of their helmets, their shields are lowered, but their hands grip the shafts of their pila too tightly. Why aren't they smiling at their new friends? Galba, the architect of this slaughter, divided the huge crowd into 3 parts. For ease of resettlement, he said. The lie was sweet as honey and just as sticky. The Lusitanians, exhausted by years of hunger and skirmishes, believed it. They laid their swords on the ground. They handed over their daggers. They stood naked before the iron beast. And then, in the ringing silence of noon, it wasn't the voice of a herald with a land deed that rang out, but the sharp, dry signal of a trumpet. Have you ever heard what betrayal sounds like? It isn't pompous speeches. It is the sound of steel leaving the scabbard, the simultaneous clang of thousands of blades. The Romans didn't start a battle. In a battle, the enemy has a chance. This was the work of a butcher in a slaughterhouse. The legionaries closed ranks and moved forward, methodically, step by step, turning the living mass into a bloody mess. No tactics, no maneuvers, just the rhythmic strikes of gladii. Thrust, step, thrust, step. Unarmed people ran in panic, trampling each other. The screams of mothers trying to shield their children were drowned out by the cold, disciplined growl of the Roman military machine. Galba watched from a hill, and in his eyes there was neither pity nor the triumph of a warrior. There was only the cold calculation of an accountant. Every dead male is -1 threat. Every surviving but enslaved woman is a ringing coin in the slave market. Think for a second. What does a person feel when they realize that their belief in someone else's honesty has become their death sentence? That day, the Romans didn't just kill thousands of people. They killed the very concept of trust. They showed the entire barbarian world that the Pax Romana is not law. It is the right of the strong to slit the throat of the weak while he looks the other way. The valley turned into a swamp, but not from rain. The earth couldn't absorb the moisture fast enough. Bodies lay in layers, forming grotesque mounds. Galba executed his plan brilliantly. 9,000 chosen warriors were slaughtered, 20,000 sold into slavery. In Rome, this act caused only mild irritation among moralists, but Galba's gold quickly shut the critics' mouths. The Republic accepted this bloody gift. After all, winners aren't judged, right? But amidst this hell, amidst mountains of corpses and the screams of the dying, something happened that neither the cunning Galba nor the wise Senate took into account. Statistics are stubborn things, but fate loves irony. In the chaos of the massacre, slipping between Roman shields, dodging spears, one man ran. His name was Viriathus. Remember that name. That day he was nobody, a simple shepherd, perhaps a petty bandit, one of thousands. He saw the Romans killing his friends. He saw the legionaries laughing as they finished off the wounded. He smelled their sweat and their triumph. In that moment, as he scrambled, gasping up the slopes away from that cursed valley, something inside him died. Fear died. Naivety died. The shepherd who dreamed of a quiet old age died. Out of the blood and mud of that day rose not a man, but a force of nature. Viriathus didn't just survive. He took with him something more dangerous than a sword. He took knowledge. Now he knew what Rome really was. He understood that you cannot negotiate with this enemy. Honor? Forget it. Nobility? Fairy tales for fools. Against such an enemy, there is only one weapon. Absolute, merciless, total hatred. The Romans, celebrating an easy victory and counting the profits from the sale of slaves, failed to notice they had missed the most important detail. They thought they had beheaded Lusitania. They thought they had broken the nation's spine. But in reality, with their treacherous cruelty, they themselves forged the sword that would soon be held to the throat of the Republic. Viriathus vanished into the mountains. He became a ghost. While Galba bathed in luxury and senators divided the skins of bears not yet killed, a new force began to gather in deep gorges and impassable forests. Viriathus did not mourn the dead. He turned his grief into a plan. He looked at the Roman camps from an eagle's height and understood. Roman steel cannot be broken in an open field. But who said you have to fight them by their rules? The surviving shepherd looked at his hands. They were used to holding a staff, but now they yearned to grip the hilt of a falcata. He wasn't going to wage a war of armies. He was going to declare a hunt. And the game in this hunt would be those who considered themselves the top of the food chain. History held its breath. From the seed of betrayal, generously watered with blood, a blackthorn began to grow that would strangle the imperial eagle. Viriathus began to gather around him those with nothing to lose, and in their eyes burned the same cold fire as in his. The war hadn't started yet, but Rome's sentence had already been signed. There in the mountains, where shadows grow longer, and every stone is ready to become a weapon. While Roman governors sent victorious reports to the Senate, describing Lusitania as a conquered province, the alchemy of war was taking place in the mountains. Viriathus didn't build fortresses. He understood what the graduates of Roman military academies could not comprehend. In a war with a giant, your only defense is the absence of form. If you are a wall, they will break you with a battering ram. If you are a mist, you will suffocate the enemy. He turned his squads into that very mist, poisonous, elusive, deadly. Imagine you are a legionary. You are part of the most perfect military machine in human history. You were taught to hold the line, lock shields, move as a single organism. You are a brick in an indestructible wall. But what good is a wall when the enemy doesn't attack from the front? Viriathus deprived the Romans of their main trump card, the pitched battle. He refused to go out into the open field, where Roman discipline grinds everything living to dust. Instead, he dragged the empire into a labyrinth. The Lusitanian mountains became the rebels' allies. The Romans called it latrocinium, robbery, banditry. What an arrogant misconception. This wasn't banditry. This was the first large-scale guerrilla war in European history, elevated to the rank of art. You walk along a narrow mountain path. The sun bakes so hard the bronze armor burns your skin. Your scutum shield weighs 22 pounds, and on your shoulders is another 60+ pounds of gear. You are exhausted. You are thirsty. You hate this stony, cursed land. And suddenly, a whistle. One stone, launched from a sling, punches through the helmet of the comrade walking next to you. He falls without a sound. The formation freezes. "Testudo!" the centurion screams. Shields lock together. You wait for the blow. You expect the barbarians to rush into the attack with screams, and you will meet them with the point of a gladius. But nothing happens. Silence. Only the wind howls in the gorge, and somewhere a raven croaks. You stand for an hour. 2. No one. You lower your shields, take a step, and another whistle. Another man down. Another breach in the formation. This is a war of nerves. Viriathus taught his people to hit and vanish. Hit and run. For the Roman mentality, obsessed with the concept of valor and open confrontation, this was unthinkable. It seemed like cowardice. But ask yourself, who is the bigger fool? The one who stands under a hail of arrows for the sake of a beautiful pose, or the one who uses every bush to survive and win? Roman patrols turned into game. Viriathus used tactics that would later be called asymmetric warfare. His warriors didn't wear heavy armor. They were light, fast. They knew every goat path, every stream. They attacked from the flanks, from the rear, from above. They swooped down like a swarm of hornets, stung in the most vulnerable places, and dissolved into the forest before the clumsy Roman column could turn around. Legionaries began to fear their own shadows. The psychological breakdown happened not at the moment of death, but in the long hours of waiting. At night, the camp didn't sleep. The snap of any twig forced sentries to stare into the darkness until their eyes burned. It seemed to them that trees were changing places, that the mountains were moving to crush them. Viriathus became a mythical monster to them, an omnipresent demon. In soldiers' tents, they whispered that he could turn invisible, that he bargained with wolves. Fear is the heaviest burden a soldier can carry, and this burden was becoming unbearable. Roman generals were furious. They were used to drawing diagrams on maps, moving figurines, operating with concepts like center, flank, rear. But how do you fight an enemy who has no center? Viriathus cancelled the rules. He showed that war is not a gentleman's sport and not a chess match. It is pure Darwinism. The survivor isn't the one with the prettier plume on his helmet, but the one who adapts faster. The Lusitanians used their weaponry with frightening efficiency. Their famous falcatas, curved swords weighted toward the tip, were capable of splitting Roman helmets and chopping off arms along with shields in a single blow. But their main weapon was speed. Appian reluctantly admitted that the Romans simply couldn't keep up with them. Heavy infantry, the queen of the fields, turned into a clumsy target in the mountains. Viriathus made the Romans feel like helpless children in a dark room. Every such skirmish, every ambush washed away not only blood from the Roman army, but also the belief in their own superiority. Officers wrote angry letters to Rome, demanding reinforcements, demanding cavalry, demanding at least something that could catch these ghosts. But the Senate was far away. There, on marble floors, the patricians still thought they were dealing with a bunch of rebels, easily dispersed by a couple of cohorts. They didn't understand that a new power was being born in the forests of Spain. Viriathus, watching burning Roman supply trains from the tops of cliffs, understood. Time was working for him. He wasn't just killing enemies, he was educating his army. Yesterday's shepherds, survivors of Galba's massacre, were turning into professional killers of the empire. They learned discipline not through a centurion's stick, but through the necessity of survival. They believed their leader not because the law commanded it, but because he led them to victory and away from death every single time. Gradually, minor skirmishes began to form a single, terrifying picture. Rome was losing control over territories. Roads became death traps. Foragers sent for grain didn't return. Garrisons found themselves under siege without seeing the besiegers. Viriathus cut the arteries of supply, strangling the legions with hunger and fear. This was no longer just a survivor's rebellion. It was a strategic operation, played by a man who had never read military treatises, but read the terrain like an open book. The Romans, accustomed to barbarians being a wild horde running onto swords with crazy eyes, faced cold calculation. And this calculation scared them more than any berserker rage. But Viriathus knew, you can't run forever. Sooner or later, Rome would send someone bigger than frightened garrison commanders. The empire slowly turned its heavy head toward the west, beginning to realize the scale of the problem. And when, in the year 147 BC, the praetor Gaius Vitellius arrived in Spain with a huge army and authority to crush the rebellion, he was sure he was going on a hunt. He saw himself as an experienced huntsman who would corner a cunning beast. Vitellius, swelling with self-importance, led his legions forward, dreaming of a triumph and a laurel wreath. He didn't know the beast had stopped running long ago. He didn't know that the moment his vanguard entered a narrow valley near a place that would be called Tribola, he stepped not toward glory, but straight into the open jaws of a trap that would snap shut with a crash audible even on the banks of the Tiber. Gaius Vitellius was a man of the old school, or at least he liked to think so of himself. A praetor commanding a 10,000-strong army, he arrived in Spain not to chase ghosts over rocks, but to put a bold period at the end of the history of another barbarian misunderstanding. When his scouts reported that Viriathus's army was running as soon as they saw Roman standards, Vitellius merely smirked smugly. There was nothing surprising in this. It was the natural order of things. Civilization advances, savagery retreats. The Romans saw the backs of fleeing Lusitanians. They saw them dropping supplies in panic, their formation crumbling into small groups. For a legionary, this sight acts like a drug. The predator instinct eclipses reason. Formation? To hell with formation. Discipline? What is it for when the enemy is already broken and you just need to stab him in the back before your comrade does? Vitellius gave the command to pursue. It was the command Viriathus was waiting for. It was the command that cost the lives of 4,000 Roman citizens. The great Roman army, forgetting caution, stretched out in a long, greedy snake, rushing in pursuit. They ran, choking on greed and excitement. until they found themselves in a place called Tribola on the maps. It was a deep gorge, overgrown with thick, thorny brush, an ideal place for those who know its secrets, and a death trap for outsiders. And right here, when the legionaries got bogged down in the thickets, when their heavy shields became a burden and long spears caught on branches, the panic of the Lusitanians evaporated instantly. The flight was a performance. The actors dropped their masks. Viriathus turned his people around. Imagine this moment. You are running after a hare, already anticipating a roast, and suddenly the hare stops, turns to you, and you see it has wolf fangs. From the bushes, from the rocks, from underground, javelins and stones flew from everywhere. The Romans were in a sack. Those in the vanguard tried to stop, but the rear ranks, not seeing the danger, kept pushing, knocking their own men off their feet. A crush. Chaos. The scream that replaced the triumphant roar was a scream of terror. It wasn't a battle. It was a beating of the blind by the sighted. Viriathus didn't just outplay Vitellius. He humiliated him. He showed that Roman manuals written in cozy villas aren't worth a broken penny in the real mud of war. The Lusitanians attacked with such fury and speed that the Romans didn't even have time to understand where death came from. Legionaries used to fighting shoulder to shoulder found themselves broken into individuals, driven into bushes, and slaughtered one by one. And what of the great praetor Gaius Vitellius himself? His end became, perhaps, the most vicious irony of this war. He didn't die in a heroic duel with the barbarian chief. He didn't throw himself onto swords defending the legion's eagle. He was taken prisoner. But here's the rub. The praetor was old, fat, and looked so pathetic in his mud and blood-stained tunic that the Lusitanian warrior who grabbed him looked at the prize with contempt. No one will give even a copper coin for this old man, the barbarian must have thought. In the eyes of a simple soldier, before him was not a symbol of Roman power, but simply useless cargo. An old, fat, worthless slave. The Lusitanian, not knowing he held one of the highest magistrates of the Republic in his hands, simply pierced him with a spear and ran on to find richer loot. The Roman commander was killed not as a hero, but as damaged goods. His corpse was left lying in the bushes, indistinguishable from the corpses of the thousands of privates he led to slaughter. Of the 10,000 soldiers who entered the gorge, barely 6,000 made it out. They ran to the coast, to the colony of Cartea, dropping weapons, losing honor, turned into a terrified herd. When the news of the rout at Tribola reached Rome, the Eternal City shuddered. It was a shock, a cold shower. It is one thing to hear about skirmishes with bandits somewhere at the end of the world. It is another thing to learn that an entire army under the command of a praetor was destroyed, and the praetor himself slaughtered like a pig. Senators in their snow-white togas exchanged anxious glances. The myth of the invincibility of the legions had cracked. Suddenly, Rome realized, this is no longer a police operation. This is not suppressing a rebellion. This is a full-scale war. And the enemy they faced is not a savage with a club. It is a tactical genius who reads the intentions of their generals better than they do themselves. The shepherd taught the educated elite a lesson in strategy, and the tuition was paid in rivers of Roman blood. Tribola changed everything. Now Viriathus's name was spoken not with disdain, but with fear. He ceased to be just a gang leader. He became a symbol. On the battlefields of Spain lay not just the bodies of legionaries. Trampled Roman snobbery lay there. Viriathus proved that the empire could be beaten, that it could be humiliated. And what was most terrifying for Rome? he was just getting started. While the surviving legionaries licked their wounds behind fortress walls, victory was celebrated in the mountains. But Viriathus didn't drink wine until he blacked out. He looked at the captured Roman swords, at the piles of trophy armor, and understood. This is only the beginning. He had woken the bear, and now the bear would come for him with all its fury. But Viriathus was ready. After all, he was no longer alone. The victory at Tribala sounded like a gong, the echo of which spread throughout Spain, calling under the shepherd's banners everyone who still remembered the taste of freedom. The victory at Tribala was not a happy accident, as they tried to convince themselves in the Senate. It was a signal that woke a sleeping volcano. If you think that Rome, having received a slap in the face, immediately realized its mistakes, you don't know the psychology of superpowers. An empire doesn't learn from the first mistake. It doubles the stakes. The barbarians simply took advantage of the moment, said the patricians, sipping Falernian wine. We just need a general who won't be an idiot like Vitellius. And they sent Gaius Plautius, then Claudius Unimanus. It turned into a grotesque assembly line. Rome sent magistrates clad in purple to Spain with their legions, lictors, and exorbitant egos, and Lusitania returned them in the form of death notices or broken, trembling men. Viriathus methodically, season after season, disassembled the Roman military machine into spare parts. Gaius Plautius, arriving with a thirst for revenge, was defeated so swiftly he barely had time to understand what was happening. His camp was captured, his soldiers scattered, and he himself was forced to hide in disgrace, becoming a laughingstock for all of Spain. Then Claudius Unimanus took the stage. He brought new forces, confident that he, with his experience, would show the savages what Roman order was. The result? Total annihilation. Viriathus didn't just win. He collected Roman governors like trophies. Battles turned into a hunt for standards. Fasces, bundles of rods with an axe, sacred symbols of the power of Roman consuls and praetors, before which the peoples of the Mediterranean trembled, now lay in the mud of Lusitanian camps like ordinary firewood. But the most terrifying thing for Rome wasn't how Viriathus fought, but how he lived. Imagine a scene that could have been the finale of an epic drama, but was merely an episode of this war. Viriathus's wedding. He takes the daughter of a wealthy aristocrat as his wife. The mountains are piled high with loot. Gold, silver, precious fabrics captured from the Romans lie in heaps. This is wealth for which senators in Rome were ready to tear each other's throats out, for which legions burned cities. Viriathus could have declared himself king. He could have put on a crown, sat on a golden throne, and drunk from goblets stolen from consuls. Any other barbarian chief in his place would have done just that. He would have gotten drunk on power and luxury. Instead, Viriathus stands in the middle of this splendor, leaning on his spear. He looks at the mountains of gold with the indifference of a man who knows the price of things. He orders the wedding tent decorated with Roman standards and fasces. This is not decoration. This is a message. He uses symbols of Roman power as cheap props, showing their worthlessness. But he does not touch the gold. I have seen how this gold turns people into slaves, even if there are no chains on their necks, he might have said. Viriathus refused luxurious clothes. He refused a throne. He divided the loot down to the last sestertius among his warriors, keeping for himself exactly as much as the lowest slinger in his squad received. This was a blow more terrible than the defeat of a legion. The Romans could understand an enemy who wants wealth. Such an enemy can be bought, bribed, his motives understood. But how do you fight a man who needs nothing? How do you defeat a leader who sleeps on the ground next to his soldiers, eats from the same pot, and shares every risk with them? His asceticism became his armor. He could not be corrupted because he despised what Rome considered valuable. Rumor of this flew across the Iberian Peninsula faster than the wind. Tribes that had slaughtered each other for centuries over a patch of pasture or a herd of goats suddenly saw something greater than tribal enmity. They saw a leader. Carpetani, Vetones, Celtiberians, peoples speaking different dialects and worshipping different gods, began to flock under the banners of the former shepherd. Viriathus achieved the impossible. He united Spain. Roman garrisons watched with horror as scattered sparks of rebellion merged into a single forest fire. This was no longer a guerrilla war of a small tribe. It was a national uprising. Viriathus created a state without borders or capitals, a state held together not by taxes and fear, but by loyalty and a shared hatred of the invaders. He showed that freedom is not an abstract concept of philosophers, but a very concrete thing. It is when you don't pay Rome, don't give your sons to their army, and don't bow your head before their officials. Panic reigned in the Senate. They were used to divide and conquer. Divide et impera. But here, this principle failed. Gold didn't work. Threats didn't work. Legions disappeared in the mountains. Viriathus became a nightmare for the Republic, the monster under the bed that even the strongest warrior fears. He became a symbol, and symbols, as is known, are much harder to kill than people. A sword can cut flesh, but it is powerless against an idea. By the year 145 BC, Rome realized they were not losing a war of armies. They were losing a war of meanings. The shepherd turned out to be morally superior to the patricians. While Roman generals stole public money and wrote lying reports, Viriathus built a new world on the ruins of their ambitions. And to destroy this world, Rome would have to draw its heaviest sword, summon its best blood, and finally forget about what they once called honor. But while songs of freedom sounded in the mountains of Lusitania and Roman eagles fell into the mud, clouds were gathering on the horizon. The empire, humiliated and enraged, was preparing a counterstrike. And this strike was to be delivered by a man in whose veins flowed the blood of the destroyers of Carthage. The game moved to a new level, where the stakes were no longer just life and death, but the very existence of peoples. And that was when Rome stopped laughing. The jokes in the Senate ended. Patricians no longer discussed the Lusitanian War between courses at banquets, because in the year 145 BC, the Republic laid its heaviest cards on the table. Not another careerist loser dreaming of easy loot landed at the docks of Tarraco. Quintus Fabius Maximus Aemilianus stepped ashore. Listen to that name. In it sounds the very history of Roman greatness. Biological son of the conqueror of Macedonia, adoptive grandson of the conqueror of Hannibal, biological brother of the destroyer of Carthage. The blood of men who redrew the map of the world with one wave of a hand flowed in his veins. Rome did not send an official. Rome sent its genetic elite. Along with him arrived 15,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. And this was not a hastily gathered rabble of Italian debtors. These were professionals, veterans whose sandals had trampled the ashes of Carthage and Corinth. Fabius Maximus brought with him what previous commanders lacked so much: iron, merciless discipline. The first thing he did was refuse to fight. Imagine the disappointment of the Lusitanians. They were used to Romans, like rabid dogs, rushing into attack at the first sight of the enemy, falling into a trap. But Fabius locked himself in the camp. For a whole year he drilled his soldiers. He taught them not to fear the screams of barbarians. He forced them to hold the line under a hail of stones. He behaved like a surgeon, carefully sterilizing instruments before a complex operation. This was no longer a hunt. It was a chess match between two grandmasters where the stake was thousands of lives. Viriathus felt the change immediately. The air became denser. The Roman army no longer crumbled. It moved as a single monolith encased in bronze. Fabius didn't climb into gorges. He didn't chase ghosts. He methodically occupied cities, cut off supply routes, slowly but surely tightening the noose on the neck of the uprising. This was the moment of truth, a clash of two worlds. On one side, a hereditary aristocrat who learned war from the scrolls of great ancestors, surrounded by the world's best centurions. On the other, a former shepherd whose university was in wolf dens and on mountain passes. Viriathus understood. Time was working against him. If he allowed Fabius to impose his game, the rebellion would suffocate. He needed a miracle. He needed to force this cautious, smart, cold Roman intellect to make a mistake. And he decided on a risk that would turn any military theorist's hair gray. The general battle unfolded near the city of Baecula. Viriathus led his troops into the field. Into the open field against the Roman phalanx. It looked like suicide. The Romans lined up in impeccable battle order, a wall of shields, a forest of spears, gleaming helmets. Fabius, watching this, must have thought the barbarian chief had finally lost his mind from despair. The battle began. The thunder of blows, screams, dust blocking the sun. The Lusitanians fought furiously, but Roman discipline took its toll. The formation of legions slowly, like a steamroller, pushed the rebels back. And suddenly the barbarian ranks wavered. It began. The Lusitanians ran. It looked absolutely natural. Chaos, abandoned weapons, the backs of fleeing enemies. This was the very moment any soldier waits for, the moment of triumph, when the enemy is broken and all that remains is to finish them off. Even the iron self-control of Fabius's soldiers cracked. The instinct of pursuit is the oldest and strongest. The Roman lines began to stretch. The formation broke. Legionaries rushed forward to grab trophies and time. And in that second, when the Romans were already mentally drinking the wine of victory, Viriathus turned around. It wasn't a rout. It was the greatest acting performance in the history of ancient wars. Viriathus used the momentum of the huge Roman machine against itself. As soon as the legionaries broke formation, the fleeing barbarians turned 180 degrees with a synchronicity a ballet would envy. And from the flanks, out of nowhere, the hidden cavalry struck. The trap slammed shut with a bone-crunching sound. What happened next was not a battle, but a lesson. Viriathus showed Fabius Maximus Aemilianus that tactical textbooks are good in a library, but improvisation rules on the battlefield. The Roman vanguard was cut off and destroyed. Elite veterans, conquerors of Carthage, fell into the mud under the blows of Spanish falcatas, just like the green recruits before them. Fabius Maximus, this Roman eagle, watched in horror as his brilliant strategy crumbled to dust. He managed to save the remnants of the army only thanks to a miracle and the approaching night. He retreated to camp, humiliated, crushed, realizing the bitter truth. Pedigree doesn't fight. Ancestors' names don't deflect sword blows. That evening, a deathly silence reigned in the Roman commander's tent. The myth that wild barbarians could be defeated simply by proper organization died. Viriathus proved that his genius was not accidental. He outplayed the best of the best on his own field. by his own rules. For Rome, this was more than a defeat. It was a dead end. They threw gold on the scales, they threw legions, they threw the honor of the Scipio family, and all of it turned out to be lighter than the will of one man. Viriathus stood on the battlefield, wiping his sword, and looked at the Roman camp. He won, but there was no joy in his eyes. He knew his enemy. Romans could forgive defeat, loss of money, or a province, but they never, do you hear, never forgive humiliation. The empire's machine stalled, swords dulled against the granite will of the shepherd. And then, in the dark corridors of Roman power, a decision began to ripen that would forever stain the Republic's toga with indelible shame. If a lion cannot be killed with a spear, the Senate decided, then it is time to put poison in its water. By the year 140 BC, the Roman Republic found itself in a situation the Senate was afraid to discuss, even in whispers. A stalemate. The great military machine that had ground down Carthage and Macedonia was stuck in Spanish mud like a chariot with a broken axle. Gold flowed from the treasury like a river. Legions melted away from disease and guerrilla raids, and the barbarian Viriathus was not only alive, he was dictating terms. Think about the absurdity of what was happening. A superpower claiming rule over the entire known world was brought to its knees by a former shepherd. The culmination of this humiliation came under the walls of the city of Erisana. The new Roman proconsul, Fabius Maximus Servilianus, repeated the mistake of his predecessors. He allowed himself to be cornered. Viriathus's army surrounded the Romans, pinned them against the rocks. It was a cauldron. Viriathus held the lives of thousands of Roman citizens in his palm. He only needed to clench his fingers, give one order, and the history of the Roman presence in Spain would have ended in a bloodbath. No one would have left alive. But Viriathus did what distinguishes a statesman from a field commander. He stopped the slaughter. He offered peace. Not capitulation, but a peace of equals. Viriathus, standing among his warriors, looked into the eyes of the Roman aristocrat, not from the bottom up, but as an equal. He wanted his people left alone. He wanted the borders of Lusitania respected. In exchange, he granted life to the entire Roman army. Servilianus, pale and shaking from realizing the proximity of death, agreed to everything. The treaty was signed, and its terms sounded like blasphemy to the Roman ear. The Senate was forced to officially recognize Viriathus as a friend of the Roman people, amicus populi Romani, to recognize the independence of Lusitania, to recognize that lands they already considered their own now belonged to these savages. This was a diplomatic triumph unequaled in the barbarian world. Viriathus achieved what Hannibal could not. He forced Rome to sign a document of its own defeat while saving face. Euphoria reigned in the rebel camp. Warriors embraced, believing the war was over. They thought the word of a Roman, sealed with a seal and an oath before the gods, was granite. What tragic, childish naivety. Viriathus, a genius of tactics, proved powerless before the cynicism of civilized politics. He judged enemies by himself. For him, a word was sacred. For Rome, a word was just a sound shaking the air. While peace was celebrated in Spain, cold, poisonous rage boiled in Rome, in the cool shade of the Curia. The patricians felt insulted. How dare some bandit grant life to Roman legions? How dare he call himself a friend? For the Roman mentality, this treaty was not an act of mercy by Viriathus, but a shameful brand on the Republic's reputation. Do you think they intended to honor this treaty? not for a single second. For Rome, diplomacy was not a search for compromise, but the continuation of war by other means. The treaty of the year 140 was not a finale for them, but simply a tactical pause. They needed time to catch their breath, regroup, and change a dulled blade for a new one. This was the moment when the mask of nobility finally slipped from the face of the Republic. The Romans smiled at Viriathus's ambassadors. They shook hands. They sent gifts. But behind their backs, they were already sharpening daggers. The Senate ratified the treaty, but immediately, in secret letters, made it clear to its generals, this peace is a fiction. Find a way to destroy it. Find a way to kill. Who is the barbarian here, you might ask? The one who spared the enemy, having the opportunity to destroy him? Or the one who used this mercy to prepare a stab in the back? History gives an unequivocal answer, but victors love to rewrite textbooks. Viriathus won the war on the battlefield, but he lost it the moment he believed one could deal with the empire honestly. He didn't understand that for Rome, the concept of honor does not exist in relations with those they consider beneath them. The treaty was just a screen. While the ink on the parchment was still drying, a new man had already left Rome. Quintus Servilius Caepio. And he brought with him not an olive branch of peace, but gold. Lots of cursed gold, intended to buy what could not be conquered with iron. Peace was an illusion. The silence hanging over the mountains of Spain was deceptive. It was the calm before the vilest and dirtiest act in the history of Roman conquests. Viriathus thought he had secured a future for his people, but in reality, he signed his own death warrant. Because Rome does not forgive those who made it afraid, and if the Roman sword broke, Roman poison would come into play. The stage was set for the last act of the tragedy, where the main weapon would not be valor, but betrayal. Quintus Servilius Caepio. The new proconsul arriving to replace the failures was a man of a different sort. If his predecessors were soldiers dreaming of glory, Caepio was a politician craving results. He looked at the map of Spain, at the casualty reports, at the humiliating peace treaty, and understood one simple thing. Viriathus could not be taken in a fair fight. This shepherd was smarter, faster, and more talented than any Roman general. Trying to defeat him with a sword was like trying to catch the wind with a net. Stupid, expensive, and useless. But every fortress has a back door. Every man has a price. Caepio decided that if Roman steel couldn't pierce Lusitanian armor, Roman gold would. He brought with him not new tactical schemes, but poison. Not the kind dripped into a goblet, but the kind poured into ears. History is often made not to the roar of drums, but in the silence of tents, under the rustle of expensive clothes and the clinking of coins. Caepio began looking for a weak link. He didn't need ordinary defectors. He needed access to the chief's throat. And he found it where Viriathus expected it least, in the circle of his closest friends. Audax, Ditalco, and Minarus. Remember these names. They won't be carved on monuments to heroes, but they will forever remain on the blacklists of history. These were not just comrades in arms. These were men with whom Viriathus shared bread, with whom he slept by the same fire, whom he trusted with his life in hundreds of battles. They were his right hand, his eyes and ears. It was them whom Viriathus, true to his naive belief in the sanctity of the treaty, sent to Caepio to confirm the terms of peace. Imagine the scene. 3 stern warriors, smelling of campfire smoke and horse sweat, enter the luxurious tent of the Roman consul. They expect arrogance, threats, arguments about borders, but they are welcomed like dear guests. Wine, fruit, soft cushions. Capio smiles. He doesn't talk about war. He talks about the future. How much longer will you rot in these mountains? He asks, insinuatingly. The war has lasted 8 years. You are tired. Your wives are tired. Viriathus is obsessed with freedom, but can you eat freedom? Can you shelter from the rain with it? Rome is eternal. You can fight us for another 10 years, but in the end, we will still win. Simply because there are more of us. And what then? Death in a ditch? Capio was a master of temptation. He painted pictures of another life before the barbarians. Roman citizenship, huge estates on fertile lands, gold, mountains of gold right here and now. No need to freeze in ambushes anymore. No need to wait for an arrow in the back every day. You just need to do one little thing. One favor for a friend of the Roman people. At first, perhaps, they hesitated. Loyalty is a habit hard to break at once. But the poison of greed works slowly. Capio pressed on the most sensitive points. He played on their fatigue. He played on their envy. Why is Viriathus a hero, and they are just shadows? Why does he decide fates, and they only execute orders? The Roman laid an argument on the table that outweighed years of friendship. The ringing, heavy reality of gold coins. In that moment, warriors died in the tent, and traitors were born. It didn't happen instantly, but rot began to eat away their souls. They looked at the gold and saw in it not metal, but the key to paradise. They convinced themselves they were doing this for the good of the people. If Viriathus dies, the war will end. We will save the people, their inner voice probably whispered, trying to drown out their conscience. The deal was struck. Rome bought victory without even taking the sword out of the scabbard. It was the most profitable contract in Capio's history. The price of the life of Rome's greatest enemy turned out to be ridiculously small compared to the cost of maintaining a single legion. Audax, Detauco, and Minurus returned to Viriathus's camp. Outwardly, they were no different from the men who left in the morning. The same tan, the same weapons, the same scars. But inside, they were already dead. They carried death with them. They rode and smiled at passing patrols. They greeted their comrades. Hypocrisy reached its absolute limit. How can you look into the eyes of a man you have already sold? How can you shake a hand you are about to chop off? Viriathus met them with joy. He was waiting for news of peace. He trusted them boundlessly. In his world, a world of honor and oaths, betrayal by friends was as impossible as the sun rising in the west. He listened to their lying reports that Capio was ready to observe the treaty, that Rome wanted friendship. He nodded, made plans for a peaceful life, perhaps allowing himself to relax for the first time in years. He didn't see their shifting eyes. He didn't smell the fear and greed radiating from them. Night fell on the camp, a quiet, starry Spanish night. Viriathus went to sleep in his tent. He always slept lightly, ready to jump up at any moment at the sound of an alarm. His armor lay nearby, his sword was at hand. He was protected from any enemy that could come from outside, but he had no protection against those who were already inside. While the camp sank into sleep, the three conspirators were awake. They exchanged glances in the dark, clutching sweaty palms. Capio's gold burned their hands even from afar. There was no turning back. They knew, if they didn't do it now, tomorrow might be too late. The fear of exposure drove them harder than hatred. This was the moment when the Roman Republic finally lost the moral right to be called a civilization. A victory obtained by the hands of hired assassins is worth no more than the life of a rat. But Capio didn't give a damn about morality. He needed a corpse. And 3 shadows, sneaking, headed toward their chief's tent, carrying in their hands not weapons for battle, but an instrument for slaughter. History froze, looking at this meanness, but did not intervene. Viriathus's fate was foreordained not on the battlefield, but in the ledger of a Roman proconsul. Silence. That night in the Lusitanian camp, it wasn't soothing, but viscous, like thick tar. If you could listen to the breathing of thousands of sleeping warriors, you would hear the rhythm of hope. These people slept soundly, believing for the first time in many years that the worst was behind them. Rome recognized their rights. The treaty was signed. Their leader, the great Viriathus, gave them a future. What a monstrous illusion. The most terrible crimes are committed not to the howl of war trumpets, but to the chirping of cicadas. Look at the 3 shadows sliding between the tents. Sentries by the fires nod lazily to them. Why not? It's Audax, Ditalco, and Minurus, the most loyal, the closest. Heroes. No one asks for a password. No one blocks the way with a spear. Trust is the very shield they lowered to strike. They walk to their chief's tent not like killers sneaking in the night, but like masters of the situation. There is no fuss in their movements, only the cold, business-like determination of people who have already spent their gold in their mines. They enter the tent. Inside, it smells of old leather, gun oil, and fatigue. Viriathus is sleeping. Look at him. Even in sleep, he remains a warrior. Appian and Diodorus tell us a surprising detail. He always slept in full combat gear. Chainmail on his chest, greaves on his legs, his hand lying near the hilt of his sword. He was ready for a sudden attack by legionaries. He was ready for a fire. He was ready for the sky to fall to the earth. His paranoia was perfect protection against an external enemy. No Roman soldier could catch him by surprise. But he didn't put on a steel collar to protect himself from friends. The traitors knew this. They knew every habit of their commander, every chink in his armor. They didn't need to stage a fight. A fight is a risk, and they didn't want to risk. They wanted a paycheck. Everything happened mundanely, disgustingly quietly and quickly. No last words, no curses, no epic finale worthy of songs. One of them, perhaps the one Viriathus loved most, simply leaned over and plunged a blade into the only unprotected place, into the throat. The strike was surgically precise. Viriathus, the man who for years led the entire Roman Republic by the nose, who defeated the empire's best generals, died without even waking up. He simply choked on his own blood in the darkness of his tent. A great legend was cut short not by a lightning strike, but by banal betrayal, bought for a handful of coins. The death that came to him was humiliatingly ordinary. It had nothing to do with the glory that surrounded his name. The killers didn't linger. They didn't watch life leave the body of the one who made them something more than just mountain bandits. They slipped out of the tent as silently as they entered. The sentries nodded after them again. 3 of Viriathus's friends headed toward the Roman camp, hurrying to exchange the warm blood on their hands for the cold silver of Consul Capio. The camp continued to sleep. Thousands of people dreamed of a free Lusitania, not knowing that their freedom was already dead and cooling on rough skins in the commander's tent. Morning brought not dawn, but catastrophe. A servant who entered the tent to wake the chief ran out with a scream that made the blood of seasoned veterans run cold. The news of Viriathus's death spread faster than a forest fire. Have you ever seen an anthill collapse if you crush the queen? It was an instantaneous, total collapse. The army, which just yesterday was a formidable monolith, capable of grinding down legions, turned in an instant into a frightened, disoriented crowd. Soldiers ran around the camp, clutching their heads. Some howled with grief, tearing their clothes. Some sat on the ground in a stupor, staring at one point. But the majority felt sticky, animal terror crawling under their skin. They suddenly realized a terrible truth. They were strong, not by their numbers, and not by their skill with the sword. They were strong by the will of one man. Viriathus was the rod that held the entire structure of the uprising together. He was their brain, their heart, their banner. Without him, they became simply a gathering of tribes, shepherds and peasants who dared to challenge the gods of war. Chaos overwhelmed the valley. Discipline evaporated. Without Viriathus's orders, squad commanders began to argue, blame each other, panic. Some suggested fleeing to the mountains. Some wanted to surrender. Some demanded revenge, but didn't know on whom to take it. The enemy was invisible. He was everywhere and nowhere. The feeling of security vanished. Everyone now suspected everyone. If the closest friends killed the chief, then who can be trusted? The Romans didn't even have to attack. They simply watched from their positions as the great rebel army devoured itself from within, with fear and despair. Viriathus's death did what 100,000 legionaries couldn't do in 8 years of war. It killed the very idea of resistance. Viriathus's body was carried out of the tent. He was dressed in the most luxurious clothes, burned on a huge funeral pyre, with lavish games and gladiatorial fights held in his honor. Warriors fought on his grave to the death, trying to wash away the shame of their helplessness with blood. But this was agony. The smoke of the funeral pyre carried into the sky not only the soul of a hero, it carried the soul of an entire people. And at this time, while the Lusitanians mourned their future, 3 horsemen rode into the Roman camp. Audax, Ditalco, and Menurus dismounted at Proconsul Caepio's tent. They were smiling. They felt like winners. They had done the dirtiest job in the history of Spain, and now came for their reward. They expected to be met as saviors of the Republic, showered with gold and honors. But they forgot whom they were dealing with. They forgot that Rome is a cold, cynical beast with its own concepts of hygiene. The door to the consul's tent opened, but what awaited them inside was not at all the solemn reception they painted in their imagination. History had prepared its final, cruelest twist for the traitors. Do you think history is a court of justice? Do you think villains get what they deserve and heroes ascend to the heavens? Forget these fairy tales. History is accounting. And on that day, in the year 140 BC, the most cynical balance sheet in the history of the ancient world was tallied in the Roman proconsul's tent. Audax, Ditalco, and Menurus stood before Quintus Servilius Caepio. Look at their faces. A minute ago they were beaming. Greed and relief splashed in their eyes. They had just accomplished the impossible, killed the main nightmare of Rome with a sword to the throat. They did what tens of thousands of legionaries, the best generals, and elephants could not do. They expected the consul to stand up now, hug them like brothers, order slaves to bring out chests of gold, and hand over papers of Roman citizenship. They already saw themselves in togas walking through the forum, respected men, saviors of the fatherland. But why is Caepio silent? The proconsul sat in his chair without moving. He looked at the 3 killers not as allies. He looked at them the way a patrician looks at dirt stuck to the sole of his sandal, with disgust, with cold, aristocratic loathing. Silence hung in the tent, deafeningly loud. The smiles on the traitors' faces began to slowly slide off, replaced by bewilderment, and then animal fear. "We fulfilled the agreement," Audax probably said hoarsely, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "Viriathus is dead. The war is over. Where is our reward?" And then Capio uttered a phrase that should be carved on the pediment of every government building of every empire in the world. A phrase that sounds like the crack of a whip. "Rome does not pay traitors. Roma traditoribus non praemiat." Think about the monstrous depth of this hypocrisy. The man who found these people himself, put the idea of murder into their heads himself, promised them mountains of gold himself, now, when the deed is done, plays the moralist. Caepio used the betrayal. He drank this cup to the bottom. But now that the goblet is empty, he smashes it on the floor. This was the highest point of Roman pragmatism. They needed Viriathus's death, but they didn't need living witnesses of their shame. To pay the reward means to officially admit that Great Rome could not win in a fair fight. It means leaving a document for the ages, confirming that the Republic stooped to hiring assassins. No, this cannot be allowed. Roman bureaucracy worked flawlessly. The logic was ironclad. You betrayed your leader, which means you could potentially betray Rome, too. A man who sold a friend has no honor, and Rome has no treaties with dishonorable people. In that moment, Audax, Ditalco, and Menurus realized what they had done. They didn't just kill Viriathus, they killed themselves. They sold their souls to the devil, but the devil decided the goods were damaged and refused to pay. They were left with nothing. They no longer had a homeland. The Lusitanians would tear them to pieces. They didn't have Rome. Rome had just thrown them into the trash. The legionaries standing guard closed the ring. Yesterday, these soldiers feared Viriathus to the point of trembling knees. Today, they looked with contempt at those who rid them of fear. Paradox? No. A soldier can respect an enemy who hits him in the face with a sword. But a soldier will never respect a rat that bites a sleeping man in the throat. Historical sources differ on what happened next, and this only emphasizes the insignificance of the traitor's fate. According to one version, they were executed on the spot, quickly, without trial, like mad dogs. According to another, they were simply thrown out of the camp without a penny in their pockets, doomed to eternal wandering and a shameful death in obscurity. Rome didn't even bother to remember exactly how they died. They became a statistical error. Caepio, this architect of meanness, didn't even dirty his hands. He got the victory. He sent a dispatch to the Senate. Viriathus is dead. Lusitania is submissive. And not a word about the price. Not a word about broken oaths. Not a word about 3 fools standing before him with outstretched hands. It was a cold shower for the entire barbarian world. Rome showed its true face. It is not the face of a hero in shining armor, but the face of a calculating usurer who changes the rules of the game right in the middle of the match. You can negotiate with Rome. You can serve it. You can betray for it. But you will never become one of them. You will always be just a tool, expendable material. The scene in Caepio's tent is the moment of truth. The mask of nobility was ripped off, but beneath it was not an ugly grimace, but absolute, icy emptiness. An emptiness in which there is no place for pity, honor, or gratitude. There are only the interests of the state. Viriathus died as a hero, and his name became a legend. His killers died as trash, and their names became synonymous with stupidity and meanness. And Rome? Rome simply turned the page. The ledger closed. Debits matched credits. Problem solved. Next question? But this triumph had the taste of rot. The Republic defeated the enemy's body, but in the process, it amputated its own soul. Refusing to pay the traitors didn't wash away the shame, it only cemented it. A victory obtained this way is not a laurel wreath, it is a collar. And very soon Rome would feel this collar start to tighten. After all, if you can buy the murder of an enemy, then you can buy the murder of a fellow citizen. Capio, without knowing it, opened Pandora's box, from which civil wars, proscriptions, and dictatorship would crawl out in the future. But now, in the year 140, it was quiet in the Roman camp. The traitors disappeared into the night. Viriathus's body burned on the pyre, and Quintus Servilius Capio slept the peaceful sleep of a man sure that the end justifies any means. When Viriathus's funeral pyre burned out, and the wind scattered the ashes, silence fell in the mountains of Lusitania. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a cemetery. Rome, having rid itself of its nightmare by the hands of hired assassins, decided to bring the matter to a logical end. The machine of the empire, no longer held back by the genius of the shepherd, rolled forward to crush the remnants of resistance. Decimus Junius Brutus took the stage. In the year 138 BC, he began what official Roman reports cynically called pacification. Do not be deceived by this soft word. In the language of legions, pacify meant to burn to the ground, kill everyone capable of holding a weapon, and resettle the rest where they would be harmless as a flock of sheep. Brutus went through the west of Spain with fire and sword. He reached the river Lima, the legendary River of Oblivion, crossing which soldiers feared losing their memory. But the irony was that it wasn't the legionaries who lost their memory. The Republic itself lost the memory of honor. Lusitania was broken. Without Viriathus, it was a body without a head. Proud tribes that just yesterday made the Senate tremble were forcibly resettled from impregnable mountains to the plains. They were forced to become farmers. They were forced to forget the taste of freedom and learn the taste of the Roman tax. Physically, Rome won a complete, unconditional victory. Spain became a province. Gold and silver flowed to the Eternal City in an uninterrupted stream, paying for the construction of new temples and aqueducts. It would seem, here it is, the triumph of civilization. Order restored, barbarians pacified. But let's look at this victory not through the eyes of a Roman accountant, but through the eyes of history. In the long run, Rome suffered its most crushing defeat in Lusitania in its entire existence. By killing Viriathus with meanness, Rome created something far more dangerous than a living enemy. It created an immortal myth. Viriathus did not disappear. He dissolved into the blood of his people, into the land of Spain and Portugal. He became an archetype, a symbol, an eternal reminder that even one man, armed only with will and truth, can bring a global superpower to its knees. Today, 2,000 years later, monuments to Viriathus stand in the cities of Spain and Portugal. Streets are named after him. Legends are composed about him as a national hero, a defender of his native land from insatiable invaders. And what of Rome? The Roman Republic, by killing the noble barbarian, launched the mechanism of its own self-destruction. This was the point of no return. The victory over Viriathus became proof that to achieve a goal, any means are good. That valor, virtus, is no longer needed if there is gold and a dagger. That a word of honor is a vestige hindering politics. This poison with which Viriathus was poisoned entered the bloodstream of Rome itself. Look at what happened to the Republic just a few decades after the death of the Lusitanian chief. The methods tested on barbarians began to be used by Romans against each other. If you can buy the murder of an external enemy, why can't you buy the murder of a political competitor? If you can break an oath for the sake of a province, why can't you break the law for the sake of power in Rome? Viriathus's shadow lay over Rome in a long, bloody trail. The Gracchi brothers, killed on the streets of Rome. Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who drowned the city in the blood of civil wars. Julius Caesar, crossing the Rubicon. All of them are children of that moral catastrophe that occurred in Viriathus's tent. The Republic began to rot from the head. The cynicism shown by Caepio became the norm. Roman generals stopped serving Rome. They began to serve their own ambitions, using legions as personal gangs, just as they used traitors in Spain. The empire, built on the bones of people like Viriathus, became a colossus devouring its own children. It reached the peaks of power, but lost its soul. Pax Romana turned into a golden cage, where safety was bought at the price of slavery, and order was maintained by fear and denunciations. Viriathus's history is a mirror we are all afraid to look into. It is not a story about the distant past. It is a warning. When a great power, intoxicated by its strength, begins to think that moral laws are not written for it, when pragmatism is placed above honor, when victory at any cost becomes the only religion, that power is already dead. It may stand for centuries more, shining with marble and gold, but inside it, the clockwork mechanism of decay is already ticking. Viriathus lost the battle for his life, but he won the battle for eternity. He remained in the memory of humanity as a symbol of unconquered will, as a reproach to tyranny. And his killers? Ave Caesar? Ave Empire? They crumbled to dust. Their greatness became ruins through which tourists wander today, unaware of how much meanness is hidden in the foundation of the Colosseum. Ask yourself a question, looking at the map of the modern world, where the strong still dictate their will to the weak. Who in this story was the true bearer of civilization? The one who built roads and baths, but violated sacred oaths? Or the one who lived in caves, but died without staining his conscience? Rome was able to buy victory, but it didn't have enough gold in the world to buy off the judgment of history. Viriathus sleeps in the earth, but his spirit is alive. And as long as there is at least one person ready to say no to the arbitrariness of force, the shepherd's war against the empire continues. The curtain falls, but the echo of that treacherous blow to the throat still sounds, reminding us, empires do not die from the blows of enemy swords. They die when they betray themselves.